This is my new transition Spur, and in my opinion, this is one of the most interesting bikes to come along in quite some time for several reasons. If you've been following my channel, you know that short travel 29ers are my absolute favorite bike category of all time. I rode my beloved Yeti SP 4.5 for almost 4 years as my only bike, but this category has exploded in the last few years, and although most have about the same amount of travel on paper, there's a clear divide in their approach. On one hand, you've got bikes like the Norco Optic and Santa Cruz Tallboy, which have really evolved into almost mini enduro bikes. So they're just as stout and overbuilt as the trail and enduro bikes in a short travel package. On the flip side, you've got bikes like the Specialized Epic Evo, which are really beefed up versions of their cross-country race bikes, designed for more casual trail riding. And somewhere in the middle, you've got this Transition Spur, which is a purpose-built lightweight trail bike made by a company you probably didn't expect. Now, what makes this bike unique is that it's almost identical in geometry to that pivot switchblade all-mountain bike that I rode a few months ago, but it's wrapped in a lightweight package that's almost 5 pounds lighter. The bike I'm riding is the middle spec X01 model with SRAM's new extended range Eagle drivetrain, RockShox's new SID front and rear suspension, and 4-piston SRAM G2 brakes. Now, my bike has a few minor spec changes that I'll get into a little bit later. But this is a perfect example of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. The geometry and carefully chosen spec add up to a bike that's truly split 50-50 down the middle between climbing and descending capability, more so than any other bike that I've ridden. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the Spur is going to descend like a downhill bike, but I do think it's going to surprise a lot of people on how little you need to dial back. For one, the bike picks up and maintains momentum amazingly fast, partly due to those fast Maxxis rolling tires. The sport-tuned suspension does a really good job of letting you know how much traction you have at all times, and the balanced geometry and super light front end means that you can really change direction on a dime and place it exactly where you want.
I think what's a little surprising is that initial plushness off the top. It's got a really nice damp feel to it, and I think that's partly just due to the RockShox suspension, but also this chassis is just really forgiving. It's got a really nice damp feel to it, and some of the spec is really nice as well, including this OneUp bar, which is designed to be really compliant. I think a lot of people would be surprised at just how hard you can hit some of this stuff, and really takes the edge off of it.
Now, there's a couple of things specifically that stand out for me on this bike, and first is the suspension feel, which isn't something that you're going to pick up from a spec sheet. The suspension is surprisingly supple off the top, and it somehow manages to take the sting off the sharp hits. Therefore, you don't get the eventual harshness that's common with most short travel bikes, telling your brain to eventually slow down. I think it's partly due to that supple RockShox suspension and the progressive feel that allows you to hit stuff without feeling a harsh bottom out. But there's more to the story as well, and that has to do with the frame. You see, this bike, like other bikes in the category, uses flex stays instead of a traditional chainstay pivot in order to reduce complexity and save weight. I found this makes the bike feel not only compliant over bumps, but help maintain traction under braking, despite having one of my least favorite summer tires out back. Notice I didn't say the word flexy. I only use the F word when describing bikes that exhibit unwanted side effects from excessive flex, such as tire rubbing against the frame or shifting issues under pedaling load, none of which I experience on this bike at all. But it's obvious to me the rear end does move around as it fights for that every last bit of traction it can get. We're more than halfway into this video, and we haven't even talked about how the Spur climbs.
When I got my Mega Tower, the first thing people would ask me is, how does the bike climb? They probably ask that because they already know that the Mega Tower is going to rip going downhill, which is funny because it's the opposite with the Spur. Nobody asked me how this bike climbs, because they just assume it climbs well, and it does.
As you'd expect from a lightweight short travel bike with a steep C-tube angle, The Spur climbs incredibly efficiently, but I'm coming from somebody used to riding heavier trail bikes. If you're coming from the XC side, your perspective may be slightly different, but I think everyone who hops on this bike will agree that there's very little to complain about, especially when you consider the Spur's intent. It's not going to be as snappy as an XC race bike, but if you're coming from a typical 30+ pound trail bike, you're going to be enlightened. Not once have I considered locking out the suspension, and for someone like me who isn't the strongest climber, the Spur is a breath of fresh air and allows me to ride longer and cover more miles in less time without plugging in. But no bike is perfect, so what can be improved about the Transition Spur? Well, a few things come to mind. Transition doesn't mention a rider weight limit for this bike, but I strongly suspect your experience may be very different for heavier riders. That's because you're more likely to reach the limits of the lightweight suspension and frame, along with those relatively small brake rotors and tires. And as soon as you start beefing up all of these components, at some point you gotta ask yourself whether you're better off with a burlier bike to begin with. Also, the spec, while mostly good, has a few misses worth mentioning. The first are those 175mm crank arms, which, in my opinion, are too close for comfort to the ground. Also, some riders with a longer torso may find the front end of the bike a bit low and hunched over, which can be solved by swapping out to a higher rise handlebar. And the massive seat post insertion means I really wish my medium frame came with the 180mm dropper post that I eventually swapped to.
Alright, I want to talk through a couple other spec changes that I made on the bike. I did go with a 34T chainring, just given the extended range 52 tooth cassette. So these are my Nobl Tr33s that I've had for a really long time, I think going on 4 years now. So they're carbon, really compliant, really comfortable, and about 27mm internal width, which I think is perfect for a bike like this. The RockShox suspension is holding up really well. There was a couple of people complaining about bushing play online with this fork, and luckily I haven't had that issue so far. The SID Luxe Shock, the first thing you look at this thing, it's like, this looks like a kid shock. It's insane, like how skinny the stanchion is. And it leaked a lot of oil initially. I think RockShox just packs in a lot of grease when they put these together. So it was a little bit alarming at first because it was collecting in this little swimming pool area. After about 8 rides or so, it finally stopped leaking oil. But really impressed with the shock so far. This is really cool, but it doesn't come with a bike, unfortunately. So this is a $20 accessory that you can get from your local bike shop. So it bolts right onto the fork without needing any zip ties, which is really nice. One other thing worth mentioning is that the brake hose is run external on this frame, which I think is going to bother some people, but personally for me, I don't mind that at all. I prefer the fact that it's easier to work on. And because it's on the non-drive side, it's not going to show up on your drive side Instagram shots, so it's nothing really to worry about.
So who's the ideal person for the Spur? Well, this might be the first time where a hardcore XC and enduro rider might actually be interested in the same bike, although for different reasons. For the XC racer, this is going to be their fun big bike, something they can pedal all day without feeling like they're dragging around a boat anchor. On the other side, the Spur is about as XC as most enduro riders would ever want to get, and it's a bike that they can ride all day while still being able to pin the descents. And for everyone else, unfortunately, there's a lot of people that are going to see that travel number along with that cute little shock and small brake rotor and completely overlook this bike for something else, which is an absolute shame because I think they're missing out on a really unique experience. But for those of you that wear your tights under your baggies, well, this is going to be your bike. And the more I ride it, the more I realize the geometry and the unique damp feel of the chassis relative to its light weight is really the secret sauce to the Transition Spur. And it's easily one of the most fun and rewarding bikes that I've ever ridden, and I can see this one remaining in the stable for a really long time. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed this review, and if you're interested in this bike and located in the San Francisco Bay Area, be sure to hit up Chad at Rhythm Bikes in Oakland, California. In the meantime, remember, those trails don't get easier, you get better. We'll see you on the next one.